Religion has profoundly influenced the sweeping American narrative, perhaps more than any other force in our history, from the time of the indigenous peoples to the present day. The National Museum of American Religion tells the surprising and compelling story of what religion has done to America and what America has done to religion, including the establishment of the revolutionary and indispensable idea of religious freedom as a governing principle in the U.S., inviting all to explore the role of religion in shaping the social, political, economic, and cultural lives of Americans and thus America itself. Join us for Season 3 of our podcast series, Religion and the American Experience, as we follow scholars and others deep into America's religious history and learn how it can inform and animate us as citizens grappling with complex questions of governance and American purpose in the 21st century. Episodes will be released monthly on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Listeners, welcome to another episode of Religion and the American Experience, a podcast of the private, digital-first National Museum of American Religion, which explores what religion has done to America and what America has done to religion. Please follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, or wherever you listen, and tell your colleagues, friends, and family to do the same. The film Conclave, released in the fall of 2024, features the Catholic Church's process of electing a new pope, which process is called a conclave. In the fictional movie, the cardinal in charge of this conclave finds himself investigating secrets and scandals about several of the cardinals who were possibly close to becoming the next pope. The response from the Catholic community has been mixed. John Mulderig of the Catholic OSV News said that, quote, rival viewpoints within the church are caricatured with a broad brush, and the deck is predictably stacked in favor of those who advocate change, close quote. He warned that, quote, all moviegoers committed to the church's creeds will want to approach this earnest, visually engaging but manipulative, and sometimes sensationalist production with caution, close quote. On the other hand, the progressive National Catholic Reporter praised the film, calling it, quote, a compelling and ecclesial call for a renewed spiritual stewardship characterized by humility, meekness, and, curiously, doubt, close quote. In that spirit, we asked a church historian who has studied papal conclaves to share thoughts about the process of choosing a pope against the background of this movie Conclave. We have invited Dr. Christopher Bellido to discuss this with us. Dr. Bellido is a medievalist, a church historian, and a professor of history at Kean University in Union, New Jersey, where he teaches courses in ancient and medieval history. He's a frequent public speaker and media commentator on church history and contemporary Catholicism. He received an MA and a PhD in history from Fordham University. His BA, magna cum laude, is from New York University, where he was a university scholar. Chris, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
If you could, please share with our listeners who the Pope, quote unquote, is for Catholics around the world.
So the Pope is the Bishop of Rome. He's the successor to St. Peter. Some people call St. Peter the first Pope. He was kind of his own thing, I think, as kind of head of the apostles. Because Jesus says, Catholics believe that Jesus says to Peter, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and I give you the keys of the kingdom. This is from the Gospel of Matthew. And whatever you hold bound on earth will be bound in heaven, loosed on earth, loosed in heaven. Those words, tu es Petrus, are in fact at the base of the huge dome that sits over St. Peter's Basilica, the dome which sits over what people believe to be the tomb of St. Peter. And so visually, St. Peter's Basilica and the Pope who is celebrating Mass at the altar represents kind of the continuity of that tradition. And so the Pope is the Pope because he is the Bishop of Rome. That's kind of Peter's first title. The word Pope or Papa from the Greek is not exclusive to the Bishop of Rome for several hundred years. You see the word being used for bishops all around the Mediterranean basin in the first 400 years of the church's history. It's only after Christianity becomes tolerated and then made legal, and then the only game in town, ultimately in 380, that the Bishop of Rome takes on kind of a broader significance. And then as the Roman Empire imploded and then disappeared, the Bishop of Rome becomes not only a religious leader, but a civil leader, kind of the mayor of Rome, the governor of that swath of land in the middle of the boot of Italy that come to be called the Papal States.
Okay, super. That's very helpful. I think it would also be helpful to understand for our listeners the organizational structure of the Catholic Church and the Vatican. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So the papacy is the longest running monarchy in world history, rivaling perhaps next in line might be the line of pharaohs in Egypt. It is very much a monarchy. It's a top-down approach, as much as Pope Francis and other popes like Paul VI and John the 23rd before him have tried to make it more participatory. Ultimately, whenever there is a study group or a group of bishops or a group of cardinals who come together and make a recommendation, the Pope says yay or nay. So ultimately, the papacy is a monarchy. Very decentralized for about the first half of the life of the church. In fact, the very Latin word papatus doesn't really start coming around until about 1050, 1100, when monarchies are beginning to cohere throughout Europe, and the popes kind of take a, if you can't beat them, join them approach. And that's where the bureaucracy really takes the lead. For instance, there are a number of French cardinals in the 12th century who take French models of administration and repeat them, right? So the royal court becomes the papal curia. The board of advisors, a cabinet to a prime minister, is the College of Cardinals. Pope Francis, who was specifically elected to reform the curia is the Vatican bureaucracy, remarkably, of only about 2,000 people for an organization that is worldwide with 1 billion people, was running amok. And basically thinking that the rest of the church worked for the Vatican, and sometimes some of those curialists made the Pope feel that the Pope worked for the Curia. And so, most recently, the Pope Francis reorganized, taking the word that had been used for department, which was congregation, and turned things into what are called dicasteries. And whether this plan will play out, who knows? It's going to take 10, 20, 30 years. But he very much wanted a curia that is at the service of the church and is not telling the rest of the global church what to do. How will that work? Not quite sure. One of the interesting things was that the election in 2013 that elected Pope Francis was known behind closed doors as an ABC election. They wanted to elect a cardinal, but anyone but a curialist. They said an outsider needs to come in and kind of knock heads together.
Okay. And the terms bishop and cardinal, explain those briefly, and any other titles that we need to know.
Sure. So the word bishop or episcopa comes from the Greek word, which means overseer or supervisor or maybe governor. It goes back to the earliest church. It was used in non-religious settings as well. A lot of the words that the church uses today came from the Roman Empire. Basilica comes from the Greek word for basileus, who is the local magistrate, the governor. A basilica was the place where the basileus sat. The Roman Empire was divided into large provinces, but smaller units called dioceses. So, why reinvent the wheel? It's working, so that's fine. At the head of each of those dioceses would be a bishop. A bishop would be someone chosen from among the clergy of that area to be both a spiritual leader and, over time, an administrative leader as well. Of the many bishops that we have around the world, at any one time, there is around 200 cardinals. Cardinals can only vote if they are under the age of 80. And that number was the number of cardinals up until the modern period was very small, several dozen. It's not until John the 23rd, who was elected by maybe a few more than 50 electors, almost doubled that, got the number up to 84. 81 people elected Paul VI in 1963, and then 111 people elected John Paul II, 115 Benedict XVI, and Francis. And so it's still not very representative, right? Because we have about 120 or 130 people representing 1 billion Catholics, and only and they are all men. There are no women as well. So the cardinals are kind of the super duper advisors. Before Francis, typically head of a large diocese. A large diocese is called an archdiocese. So a bishop of an archdiocese is called an archbishop. And of the biggest of those, they tend to get what we call the red hat of being a cardinal, although Francis mixed that up a little bit. He didn't always give the red hat to a place that normally had one in the United States. We think of Detroit, St. Louis, Philadelphia, but these are not places where the church is gaining, is growing. San Diego, Houston, these are places where the church is growing, and they did get red hats from Benedict and Francis over the last several decades.
Okay. All right. That's helpful for us. Now, to get more towards the conclave itself, what happens when a pope dies up until the process to choose the next one?
Well, do you want to know the past or do you want to know the current situation?
Give us both in brief.
Okay. How about a quick history lesson?
Yeah.
For the first 1,000 years of the church's life, it seems that the local clergy in Rome, the local clergy in and around the suburbs of Rome, kind of chose the first among equals, the person who was, logically had the charisma and the know-how. In some of the darker centuries of the 6th, 8th, 9th centuries, Roman families kind of made the papacy their own plaything. It's not until about 1050 that as the papacy is being created as a monarchy, that people begin to say, well, if we want bishops and abbots and abbesses to be elected independently throughout Europe at that time, then right at the center, that election should be independent. So the cardinals become the logical group, and they begin to get the leading and then the exclusive by 1274 right to vote, in which they are locked up in a room. And that happens because of the election. The longest interregnum time without a pope was 2 years and 9 months between 1268 and 1271. And the pope had died in Viterbo, and the process was that you voted wherever the pope died. And the people of Viterbo got so fed up that they locked the cardinals in a room. And when they didn't elect, they ripped the roof off. The pope who was elected almost immediately, Gregory X, knew a good thing when he saw it. And so he said, well, let's put this into play. And so you're locked up with a key, in Latin, conclavis, with a key, becomes the English word conclave. And so since then, that's been the process. Secrecy, not always quite sure. Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor in 1549 said, I know when the cardinals visit their chamber pots. So secrecy is secrecy. It's only until after 1800 when there's an election and Napoleon is breathing down the neck of the church. Of course, he had taken Pope Pius VI physically prisoner. That people start to say, maybe we should burn the ballots. And that's the beginning of the black smoke and the white smoke.
Okay. So, what else? So this conclave that you just described, give us a little bit more detail now of what happens when they're locked up together.
Sure.
Great history lesson. Thank you. And now give us some more detail.
Sure. So it used to be that the cardinals were locked into the room surrounding the Sistine Chapel, and curtains were put up. And when you have a couple of dozen people, that kind of works. But as the College of Cardinals grew, relatively exploded to 120. John Paul II had a dormitory built, the Domus of St. Martha, and that's usually used as a residence for visiting dignitaries, bishops, abbesses, etc. But its real reason was to be the dormitory where the cardinals, basically as a sequestered jury, were shuttled between the dormitory and the Sistine Chapel. And the first time that ever happened was 2005, the election after John Paul II created this system. It's not a new system, it's just an adaptation to the modern world in larger numbers. So basically what you have now is a sequestered jury concentrated in two areas, the dormitory and the Sistine Chapel. And so once a pope dies, a papal death or resignation is a starting pistol. If there's a resignation, there's a certain date at which the resignation takes place, and then the conclave occurs 15 to 20 days after that. Can be a few days before 15 if everybody's there. It has to be no later than 20, regardless of all the cardinals are there. But let's say a pope dies. That starting pistol, the death of the pope, the funeral is 4, 5, or 6 days after, followed by 9 official days of mourning and special masses, and then 9 plus 6, 15, the cardinals are about ready to go. In the meantime, daily, the cardinals have been meeting to speak a few words each, 2 or 3 minutes, publicly on the qualities of the next guy. Someone might come in and say, we need a hardliner, and someone else might say, no, we need somebody from the global south where the church is growing. They're not using names, they're using types of people, but they're dropping hints left and right. But the real politicking does not take place in the Sistine Chapel. That's where the voting takes place. The real politicking takes place over meals and things like that, and drinks, and you saw some of that in the movie Conclave. But the voting process itself goes like this. So the first night of the conclave, everyone is locked in, as was depicted correctly. Conclave was pretty good on the details, the movie. All electronic communications are cut. There'll be no iPads, no telephones, certainly no cell phones. There'll be electronic jammers to keep people from listening from afar. And everyone goes into the Sistine Chapel. There are a few staffers, and everyone from staffer to the oldest, most senior cardinal takes a vow of secrecy, that they will never divulge what happens within the conclave without the express written permission of a pope. And if you break that, the penalty is excommunication. And so once they do all of these sweeps, there's a very dramatic moment where one of the cardinals yells, "Everybody out!" Except in Latin, that's "extra omnes." And then they seal the doors. That first evening, it's usually the evening by the time they have a mass and do all these things, there's one vote. And that one vote, we learn later, because even though secrecy, cardinals gossip like the rest of us and drop hints, is usually people are voting for someone who won't get elected, but they want to acknowledge many years of service. But they're looking for who's the dark horse that's emerging. Is the person that people thought might be pope really not getting that much support? And then things really get going the next day. So the cardinals sit twice a day to vote. And each time they sit, they vote twice. So in the morning, they vote. If there isn't 2/3 or 2/3 plus 1, that's the margin, they immediately vote again. If there's no winner there, they break for lunch, they come back and they repeat it. Each cardinal has a list of cardinals in front of him and a number of pre-printed ballots that say, "Eligo in summum pontifectem," I elect as supreme pontiff. And they're supposed to write in a name and disguise their handwriting, fold the piece of paper, and then each cardinal walks down the aisle of the Sistine Chapel. All of this is laid out in regulations, holding the ballot aloft. And then when he gets to the front, says in Latin, a long version of, "This is the person who before God I think should be chosen." They put it in, used to be a chalice when it was small. Now it's kind of like, looks like a wok, like a big urn. And then once everyone has done this, they count the ballots. If the number of ballots doesn't match the number of cardinals, 117 cardinals, but 118 ballots or 116 ballots, they're burned immediately. But if the number matches, let's say 117 to 117, one cardinal opens it, jots down the name. Second cardinal opens it, jots down the name. Third cardinal opens it, announces the name, and then, this is spectacular, takes a needle and thread and punches through the word eligo to cancel the ballot. Americans who are watching this will remember the famous hanging chads of the 2000 election. And then all of that gets put together. If there's no election, they burn. If there is an election, they stop and they go whenever that time comes, and they go to the man who has the number, and they ask him two questions. And they ask him, do you accept election? Now, there are two ways in Latin to ask a question. One elicits a yes answer and one elicits a no answer. So, for instance, we might say to a child who has spoken out of turn, you didn't really mean that, did you? Right? And they would say, oh, no. Well, the form of the Latin here is acceptasne, which is you do accept elections, don't you? The answer is yes. And then by what name will you be called? Again, correctly depicted in Conclave, or a wonderful old 1960s movie, The Shoes of the Fisherman. And at that point, from that moment on, that split second, that person is Pope. We used to have something called coronation. We don't do that anymore. We have kind of an inauguration mass, but that person is Pope with full powers of Pope from that moment. Now, does it have to be a cardinal? The answer is no. I could be elected. It need be only a baptized male. Theoretically, a Lutheran could be elected. It says a baptized male. That's what the rules say. But the last time they went outside the conclave was 1378. And that was the year they elected an archbishop. And that led to the Great Western Schism, where we had a pope in Rome and a pope in Avignon, and later on a third pope. So I don't think that's going to happen again.
Right. Okay. And tell us a little bit about the smoke. So you mentioned it in your history. So that is something that many people, the general public, has heard about, right? The smoke that comes up. Remind us of the history, and then how does this work?
So the reason they started burning ballots was in the early 19th century, when particularly they thought, well, maybe we need to remove the weight of the suggestions of some of the political leaders, and then afterwards we don't want anyone knowing where things were going, and so that's why they start burning the ballots. But people in the church, when they hear the word tradition, they think everything is 2,000 years old, and the conclave itself is less than half as long as the life of the church. The rickety oven stove that they will use has only been used since 1939, and it used to be that you would put in wet straw or dry straw for black smoke or white smoke. But if you can imagine, a bunch of elderly gentlemen who probably have trouble using a TV remote, trying to figure all of this out. Now there are these capsules that they put in. For black smoke, put this capsule in. For white smoke, put this capsule in. And the black smoke indicates no election, and the white smoke indicates election. And that's why everyone in the piazza is yelling out Bianco, Bianco, white.
Okay. So thank you for all of that. So now this question is important. What did Conclave get right, and what did it get wrong?
It gets a lot of the details right. Now, I'm not a film critic. I do agree that it kind of dealt in caricatures. I would say that that's true. I have no opinion, because I have no knowledge on the issue of the hermaphrodite cardinal being chosen as pope, and whether that person would be eligible or not. I have no idea. But it does get a few things wrong. So one is, if you remember, Cardinal Lawrence hears the confession of a nun, and then takes the information that he got from that confession and confronts a cardinal from Africa, whose name I don't recall. And it turns out that many years ago, this nun and the then priest had had a child together. And a priest may not reveal what he hears in a confessional. He's broken the seal of confession. So that was incorrect. The second part that was incorrect was that Cardinal Lawrence has a bishop who is kind of running interference for him, trying to find out information about this or that candidate. Now, that couldn't take place in two ways that seems to be occurring. One was, once you're locked in, you're not allowed to leave, right? They even lock doctors in just in case. And so this bishop running in and out is incorrect. And you could say, well, he could, do research. He could Google it, right? Well, no, because all of that is cut off as well. All of the electronic communications is cut off as well. The third thing is that the man who ends up being elected, spoiler alert, the man who ends up being elected, no one knew that he was a cardinal. So sometimes a pope will name a cardinal in there's the Latin phrase and the Italian phrase in petto or in pectore, in his chest or in his heart. And that person is not a cardinal unless the pope who made him cardinal reveals that. So in the case of the film, the pope who made him cardinal died without revealing it. So him showing up basically saying, but I have a note, wouldn't work.
Okay. Fair enough. Did I sensed in the movie that there was quite a bit of basically there are two ways to go: conservative or liberal. Keep things. Is this generally a sort of strong thread in the minds of cardinals as they participate in a conclave, or is it?
Cardinals are human beings, and unfortunately, we live in a virulently bipolar world. And of course, media, politicians, pundits, church historians, theologians, we can't but help but view the rest of the world through our own prisms. And so it's really not helpful. For instance, John Paul II, everyone calls this staunch conservative. Yes, but okay, he helped defeat communism, but he was as strong a critic of capitalism as he was against communism. The people who champion him as a great conservative conveniently forget that he was criticizing the capitalists for, the outcasts and the poor and the terrible living conditions and environmental impact that capitalism can, not always, but can produce. And so if you put John Paul II on an American political spectrum or on any political spectrum, he's way on the left wing when it comes to issues of what we would call social justice, but conservative, but not reactionary when it comes to issues of theology. And so it kind of, there's much more gray involved in this. And it's very, very hard to handicap these races. I think pattypower.com still has it that you can bet on not only who will be elected, but when they will be elected and how many ballots there will be and what name he will take. People will bet on anything. But, for my money and looking at, we don't have a big data set. So since 1788, there have been 60 American presidential elections. In that same amount of time, there have been only 16 papal conclaves. So that's not a very large data set. So if we just look at, the last 50, 60 years, there's an expression. He who goes into the conclave pope comes out a cardinal. the favorites won't win. Well, maybe, maybe not. In 1963, everybody said Cardinal Giovanni Montini, the Archbishop of Milan, is going to be the next pope. And that's exactly what happened. But then in 1978, I mean, they didn't even know how to pronounce Votiva. And Cardinal Carberry of St. Louis, who kept his vow of secrecy, said in an interview, "I would love to tell you what happened to create that moment of the first non-Italian pope in 555 years. It would thrill you," he said, "but I can't." 2005, everyone figured, well, they're probably going to pick an older man because the 27-year papacy of John Paul II was too long. He was elected at the age of 58, and of course, Parkinson's just crushed his body. It was hard to watch in the last several years or the last several months, especially. So we need someone who is kind of middle of the road. We need someone who's going to knock up the curia, knock heads together in the curia. Yes, sure, all of that. All of that equaled Ratzinger, Joseph Ratzinger, who took the name Benedict XVI, except if you go back, nobody had Ratzinger high on their list. Nobody. I mean, people will say, oh, yeah, well, I threw his name off, in listing 10 other names. Nobody had Ratzinger. Nobody had Bergoglio on their list in 2013. So the kind of fun thing is I'm a baseball fan, and there's always some utility second baseman who makes some huge play in the World Series to win the game and maybe the series. History says expect the unexpected.
Right. And you're saying that's what happens. Last question before we get to the final one that I ask all guests. How would you characterize the discussions of the cardinals as they collectively try to figure out who the next pope should be?
I think largely because of Francis, they are going to be far more frank. Francis was very much a pope who, to the degree he could, wanted to decentralize decision-making. He had a series of synods. And at the first synod, which was 2014 and 15 with the bishops, he was frustrated because under John Paul II and Benedict XVI, bishops showed up, they got their marching orders, and they left. And Francis, who was trained as a Jesuit, is has a much more collegial style. And so he finally, kind of exasperated, used a Greek word, parousia, Parrhesia, parousia, to say, that's openness. And he said, let no one say, this can't be said. His idea was throw all the ideas out, the good ones will rise, the bad ones will fall. And I think people have learned to be more frank. As an example, nobody criticized John Paul II and Benedict XVI openly. Francis's enemies criticize him openly all the time. Sometimes, to my mind, disrespectfully and disgracefully. You can disagree, but you don't have to do it disagreeably. And they enjoy an amnesty that they denied to others under the prior two papacies. So I think that there has been a bit of a culture change there. And in fact, in his own 2 or 3 minute intervention in the meetings that the Cardinals had before 2013, this is not unlike, by the way, the movie Conclave, where the man who's elected stands up and says some influential things. What Bergoglio, Cardinal Bergoglio, said a few days before he was elected, and this has been confirmed by him and by others, is that he said, we have become a closed church, a clerical church. We only care about himself. Later on in his career as papacy, he called the Curia a nest of our mediocrity. He says, Jesus is knocking to be let out of the church. Jesus is something that we keep for ourselves, and we need to let him out in a culture of encounter. And so I think now that the papacy of Francis, which went more than 10 years, was only supposed to be, 4, 6, 8, may have changed that culture. So I think that they will be very frank. I hope they are very frank.
Yeah. Last question. As we conclude, Chris, do you want to share any lessons or takeaways from these topics, either in terms of important historical transformations you are charting or in terms of helping us better understand our present moment in the American narrative?
Well, I think that we can learn a lot from Benedict XVI and Pope Francis, two popes who are often placed in opposition, but theologically, fairly conservative. Different emphases, of course, different styles. Ratzinger, Benedict XVI, more doctrinaire, Francis, more pastoral. Not one is better than the other. You need different papacies and different popes and different periods to do things differently. There's no one way of being a pope. But both of them incredibly humble. I remember the day that Benedict resigned, the first thing that came to my mind was, that's the most humble act I've ever seen in my life. And the day he died, when I did some commentary for CNN at his funeral, I had the same exact comment. There's a lot that's made of Francis not wearing the red slippers, not staying in the papal apartments. Okay. Yes, that's true. But he has also given us a very humble way of serving, servant leadership, of being a servant for others. And so I think the humility, each in his own way, of the last two popes is something that the world really needs now, because I think we see a lot of the arrogance of power. We see narcissism. We see malignant narcissism, either in individual people or of nations. I'm not a big Bible reader, but I don't think I've ever seen the passage that says, "Blessed are the smug." And so I think these two popes remind us that it's the meek and the poorest among us that we have to care for.
Okay, thank you. May I ask, do you think Pope John Paul II was meek and humble as you described the next two?
I wouldn't say that I don't want to be quoted as saying, no, he wasn't meek and humble. He was a humble person. He was an extrovert.
Okay.
He was an actor. He was a wonderful, unbelievable communicator. I mean, I wish I had half of those communication skills. And so that's why, I get a little nervous because about answering that, because I don't want it to sound that he wasn't humble. It was just a person, but it wasn't so much a marker. You know what I mean? I'll tell you a story. So in the last 4 months of his life, John Paul II was really sick and going back and forth to the hospital January through April of 2005. And so there were a number of kind of death watches. Right. And once I was being shuttled, because sometimes media studios will send a car for you. And I was being shuttled between one studio and another. And the driver and I fell into these wonderful conversations. And it turns out that he was Muslim. And he said, he was speaking of John Paul II, and he said, you have a pope who really knows how to pope. And so I think all popes pope in their own way.
Right. Absolutely. Okay. We have been talking with Dr. Christopher Bellido, medievalist, church historian, and professor of history at Kean University in Union, New Jersey, and frequent public speaker and media commentator on church history and contemporary Catholicism. Listeners, don't forget to follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you have enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you would write us a review. Chris, thank you so much for giving your time to help us understand the process of choosing a new pope in the Catholic Church. It was super informative and enlightening, and I hope you've enjoyed the time with us as well.
Always enjoy talking and teaching. Thanks very much for having me.
The podcast series Religion in the American Experience is a project of the National Museum of American Religion. Episodes will be released monthly on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.